Having spent well over 20,000 hours of my adult life sitting in the operating seat of one large transport aircraft or another, be that a Boeing or an Airbus, I think I can say with some level of authority that the piloting of such complex machines doesn't lend itself well, and for good reason, to the actions of an independent thinker. Now don't get me wrong, this viewpoint isn't intended to discourage good airmanship, where thinking outside of the box may well be appropriate and necessary in the context of problem solving and overall decision making. Indeed, most airline training departments would acknowledge and value just such a skill set with regard to the development of a proactive leadership style. Now, what I'm referring to here is the operational culture that carefully governs how these machines should and need to be handled. Specifically, what I'm talking about are standard operating procedures and a set of clearly defined rules which outline not only the physical actions and tasks of a pilot on the flight deck, but even the language used in the execution of such tasks. The operation of these complex machines require, by their very nature, a strict choreography by their crews, which the operator, per regulation, is obliged to oversee in order to ensure compliance. There is, on every large transport aircraft, a strict protocol as to when and how things should be done. These procedures are designed to satisfy one objective and one objective only, that being the consistent, safe operation of these aircraft by those charged with flying them. Were a crew either individually or collectively to willfully disregard or violate such standard procedures, the operation may well be exposed to an element of risk, a risk potentially varying from the inconsequential to the downright catastrophic. And in the case of Air Canada 621, the latter is exactly what happened on the morning of July 5th, 1970, in the skies over Ontario, Canada. .621 was operated that fateful morning by a McDonnell Douglas DC-8 63 series aircraft, which departed Montreal's Dorval International, ultimately bound for Los Angeles on the US Pacific coastline, with one scheduled stop en route, that being Toronto's Pearson International. The leg between Montreal and Toronto would be a relatively short affair, with the airborne time expected to be no more than about 45 to 50 minutes. Once on the ground in Toronto, the aircraft will be turned around in a fairly sprightly manner, uplifting additional fuel and facilitating the joining of additional passengers before continuing on its way westbound across the North American continent to California. The aircraft listed on the Canadian registry as Charlie Foxtrot Tango India Whiskey still had that new smell about it, having only been delivered to Air Canada a mere 9 weeks beforehand, the second to last aircraft of the type to be incorporated into the airline's fleet. At the time, during those years of the early 1970s, Air Canada was operating a fleet of 42 such aircraft, which had, over the previous 10 years, become a trusted and reliable workhorse of the airline's mid to long-range network. In command that Sunday morning would be one Captain Peter Hamilton, aged 50. Hamilton had been with Air Canada since leaving the Royal Canadian Air Force post-World War II, and during those intervening 26 years had accumulated just under 19,000 hours with the airline, a total of 2,900 of which had been logged in the cockpit of the DC-8, 197 hours on the 63 series variant. Having visited friends on Friday night, the Saturday evening immediately prior to the accident flight had largely been spent at home due to inclement weather, with his family recalling that he had relaxed with a book and retired at about 11 o'clock. Awakening at 5:15 on the Sunday morning, 2 hours prior to 621's scheduled departure time, he remarked that he had slept well and was well rested. Joining him on the flight deck would be his two colleagues, First Officer Donald Rowland, aged 40, and overseeing the flight engineers stationed to the rear of the cockpit, Second Officer Geordie Hill, aged just 28. With a background somewhat similar to Hamilton's, Rowland had also started his flying career from within the ranks of the Royal Canadian Air Force, having made the move to Civvy Street in 1957 when he joined Air Canada. Since joining the airline 13 years ago, he had logged a total of just over 7,100 hours of flying time, 5,600 of which had been gained on the DC-8, with again 115 hours specifically being logged on this particular variant of the type. In fact, on completion of his conversion course onto the DC-8, Rowland had initially flown as a second officer operating the flight engineers panel for a period of approximately 14 months before being laid off by the company as the airline went through a period of downsizing, adversely impacting the overall piloting numbers. He was, however, subsequently recalled to duty some 2 years later, on the 15th of April 1964, and following refresher training was reinstated to his previous flight engineer's position on the DC-8 fleet. His luck changing for the better, 2 years later Rowland successfully completed his upgrade training and was promoted to first officer in the right-hand seat of the DC-8 during the month of May 1966. Although on the surface this progression would be indicative of an individual competent in their role, a more than superficial examination of his training file suggested a somewhat differing perspective. It was true to say that on more than one occasion, previous members of the training department had drawn attention to the fact that his attitude and application had been considered below standard, although generally conceding that he was nonetheless capable of performing the duties of a first officer. Comments relating to his slow learning of procedures and overall lack of confidence would sadly stay with him throughout his career progression, with his overall performance best described as inconsistent. By way of example, an entry on his file dated September 19, 1967, indicated that Rowland was considered to have satisfactory potential to eventually become a captain with the airline. However, in contrast, a further letter dated July 31, 1968, a mere 10 months later, written by one Captain Edwards, Assistant General Manager of Flight Operation, considered Rowland to be of extremely doubtful captain material. Elaborating, Edwards drew specific attention to certain errors and omissions made by Rowland on the check flight in question. Deficiencies in his performance were classified not of the aircraft handling variety, but rather a propensity to miss checks and applicable standard calls. Subsequent to this check flight, Rowland's performance was again reviewed a number of weeks later, where he was evaluated as satisfactory, with some reservations being noted. In general, the tone of the report clearly pointed to the need for further improvement. His two final check rides, one in August of '69 and the other in November of the same year, both read fairly favourably, with the general feedback being considered satisfactory to good. The check of November '69 was to be just 8 months prior to the accident flight, 621. In the immediate days preceding the accident, it was noted that Rowland and his wife had just returned from a holiday in the United Kingdom. His wife recalled him being well rested and relaxed. Time that weekend had been spent at home, entertaining friends and attending to some routine domestic chores. On the night before the flight, he retired at about 11 p.m, slept well and awoke at about 4:45 the following morning, 2.5 hours before the flight's eventual takeoff. In relation to the third member of the flight crew, that being Second Officer Hill, the subsequent accident report says very little. Much less experience than either of his colleagues up front, Hill had been with the company for only 3 years, having joined in September 1967. With little flying experience prior to joining the airline, he had amassed a total of just over 1,000 hours, all on the DC-8, 122 hours of which had been specifically gained on the 63 series derivative. Having recently moved into a new home, Hill had spent the days immediately prior to the flight attending to the multitude of chores that this had given rise to. It was reported that he retired the night before the accident at approximately 10:30 and awoke well rested the following morning at about 5:15. As 621 commenced its descent towards Toronto, with Hamilton himself handling the controls as the flying pilot, the DC-8's cockpit voice recorder recounted a cordial, relaxed and friendly atmosphere in the flight deck, with procedures being executed in the expected professional manner. However, that said, at 0802 and 36 seconds, as 621 turned finals for runway 32, just 4 minutes before the jet's eventual touchdown, a comment was made by Rowland which opened up a brief dialogue between himself and Hamilton that immediately caught the investigation team's attention. While calling out completion of the routine items on the before-landing checklist, Rowland had stated,
"Check 3 greens, 4 pressures, spoilers on the flare. Oh, no, on the ground."
Hamilton responded,
"All right, give them to me on the flare. I've given up. I'm tired of fighting it.
Which resulted in chuckles of laughter reverberating throughout the cockpit. So what had been said, and what exactly did it mean? In order to answer these two questions, it'll be necessary to understand not only Hamilton's mindset, but also the company culture in Air Canada at the time. This was not the first time that Hamilton and Rowland had flown together, and on previous duties the captain had indicated his preference to deploy the ground spoilers on the ground after the aircraft had touched down, which was unquestionably a conscious and deliberate deviation from the company's standard operating procedures, which called for the spoilers to be armed much earlier on the approach, in advance of the landing checklist, so that they could instead be automatically deployed with the jet's touchdown. Arming of the spoilers for ground operation per the standard operating procedures required the pilot lift the associated lever in the cockpit vertically upwards, where it would be subsequently held in the armed position until sensing the aircraft's touchdown, at which stage the lever would be driven to the extended position, thus deploying the spoiler panels on the upper surface of the wing. If left disarmed, as was Hamilton's preference, after touchdown the lever could be manually pulled into the extended position, thereby achieving the same result. The design of the DC-8 was such that in flight, with the landing gear retracted, all spoiler devices remained flush with the wing's upper surface, and were of no use to the pilot at all. With gear extension, however, the flight spoilers were to all intent and purposes unlocked, and now free to deflect in harmony with aileron movement on that wing, in order to enhance roll authority and response. Thus, where the intention was to turn the aircraft to the right, the aileron on the right wing would be raised while its corresponding roll surface on the left wing would be deflected downward, the degree of deflection being proportional to the rate of turn being demanded. With regard to flight spoilers in such circumstances, again, once the gear in the DC-8 had been extended, those on the side of the upward moving aileron would likewise be deflected upward, while the corresponding devices on the side with the downward deflecting aileron would remain flush with the wing's upper surface. In order to increase drag and expedite descent, without significantly increasing forward airspeed, the DC-8 was one of the few, certainly commercial aircraft, certified for partial deployment of the engine reversers while airborne, this being facilitated in both of the inboard engines simultaneously. That being the case, manual extension of the flight spoilers through usage of the lever in the cockpit was never envisaged. Indeed, the manufacturer had cautioned against such practice, with the lever really only being designed to provide an alternative means of deploying the ground spoilers after landing, should the automatic system fail for some reason. That said, however, what many pilots failed to appreciate at the time was that once the landing gear was extended, if the pilot was to pull the spoiler lever rearward in flight, simultaneously both the flight and the ground spoilers will be extended, thereby spoiling the airflow over the wing, thus destroying the wing's lift with a corresponding increase in drag. On the ground after touchdown, whether deployed manually or automatically per company procedures and manufacturer recommendations, both flight and ground spoilers will be deployed simultaneously in a combined effort to dump lift from the wing, thereby increasing weight on the wheels and thus braking efficiency, as well as giving rise to increased aerodynamic drag on the landing roll, which in conjunction with the wheel brakes would assist with deceleration. In total, there were a combination of 5 spoilers on each wing, 2 ground spoilers inboard and 3 flight spoilers outboard. So, in indicating an initial preference to deploy both the ground and flight spoilers manually after touchdown, Hamilton's intention was to have Rowland pull the lever into the fully extended position after the aircraft had settled on the landing runway. The reason for Rowland's initial self-correction when clarifying when the spoilers were to be deployed stemmed from his own personal preference, which, although similarly non-standard in application, leant towards arming the spoilers during the flare manoeuvre as the aircraft's nose was raised slightly just in advance of main gear touchdown in order to arrest its rate of descent. Having flown together previously, the routine and personal idiosyncrasies of both pilots was well understood to the other, Hamilton for his part preferring to extend manually on the ground after touchdown, with Rowland preferring the latter technique of arming the devices during the flare. Thus the practice had been that whichever pilot was flying the aircraft, the other would execute his desired technique at the appropriate time. It was for this reason that Hamilton's apparent capitulation on the day to having the spoilers armed during the flare rather than deployed after touchdown had given rise to so much hilarity on the flight deck. But this subtle and apparently inconsequential deviation would, within the next 7 minutes, not only take their lives, but also the lives of their 6 cabin crew colleagues and the 100 passengers in their charge, in what would be Canada's worst air disaster to date. So why had both pilots each independently chosen to adopt alternative techniques to those advocated by the company Air Canada and the manufacturer McDonnell Douglas? Was this a random occurrence of deliberate procedural non-compliance, or was there more to the story than meets the eye? In researching the events surrounding the loss of Canadian Pacific Airlines Flight 402, a DC-8 which struck the approach lights and seawall during a night landing attempt in poor visibility at Haneda Airport in Tokyo on the evening of March 4th, 1966, Hamilton had independently formulated the opinion that the accident was in part caused by the arming of the ground spoilers in flight, and although the official report never came to such a conclusion, the accident had nonetheless, in his mind, created a bias against such action. As if to vindicate this position, some 2.5 years later, another DC-8 owned by Scandinavian Airlines, while en approach to Bergen, Norway, was involved in an incident whereby its ground spoilers had been involuntarily deployed during flight. The event, which had been duplicated during the subsequent investigation, was ultimately attributed to spurious electrical voltage and resulted in the manufacturer eventually modifying the components responsible. Although McDonnell Douglas's remedy had indeed proved successful and did mitigate against any similar reoccurrence in the future, Hamilton, for his part, remained sceptical. Indeed, such was the strength of his conviction that it moved one particular check captain to make the following comment on completion of a more recent line check. Review proper method of arming and using spoilers. Post-accident, when Hamilton's records were reviewed, this check captain was interviewed with the hope that he could elaborate further on his observations. He stated that his remarks stemmed from the fact that Captain Hamilton had not wished to arm the spoilers on the before-landing checklist, as was the standard operating procedure, but rather preferred to extend them manually after the aircraft had touched down. The check pilot stated that at the time he had told Hamilton to arm the spoilers as laid down in the DC-8 manual, which he reportedly did. But the truth was that Hamilton's viewpoint wasn't unique. Rowland hadn't simply adopted his alternative technique by way of some misguided loyalty to his captain on the day. No, rather he had seen many other captains do likewise on the line. In fact, it was probably fair to say that amongst Air Canada DC-8 pilots of the day, this particular procedural non-compliance wasn't altogether that unusual. But if this was the case, how would the company's own internal quality control mechanisms fail to pick it up? Alarmingly, in what would only be uncovered during the post-accident investigation, numerous Czech pilots who had been interviewed attested to the fact that, having indeed observed the practice firsthand, they had nonetheless deliberately decided not to annotate the report forms of an otherwise unblemished performance with what was considered by most to have been nothing more than a minor infraction. Quiet words may have been had post-flight, but there was an agreement that nothing would appear on paper, and so, left to their own devices, far from the gaze of the company's training and checking personnel, many of the airline's captains had continued to promote and normalise this non-standard activity. But surely not all Hamilton's colleagues had been similarly influenced by the accident events just mentioned. Indeed, for many, although their actions on the flight deck mimicked those of Hamilton, their misgivings had apparently been carried over from experience of earlier versions of the DC-8, namely the 40 series derivative, which had been the precursor to the accident aircraft of Flight 621. With the earlier designed DC-8 40 series machines, automatic deployment of the ground spoilers after touchdown required a weight-on-wheel signal to be generated with compression of the aircraft's nose landing gear. As this signal generation had a reputation for being unreliable at times, plus the fact that a not insignificant amount of runway would invariably be used up before the nose wheel had been derotated onto the concrete, many captains of the type had grown accustomed to manually deploying the ground spoilers themselves, in an effort to improve upon overall reliability and landing performance. The 60 series aircraft which followed, however, had been modified so that automatic deployment of the ground spoilers would occur primarily as a result of main landing gear wheel spin-up on touchdown, rather than waiting for compression of the nose gear. Although the earlier 40 series methodology was nonetheless retained on the later series aircraft, in order to ensure redundancy against system failure. In truth, this largely did away with the need for any manual deployment system, but it appeared that neither those pilots who flew the 40 series variant nor the manufacturers themselves were in any rush to change long-established practices and habits. With the aircraft now established on the backcourse ILS for runway 32 at Pearson, Roland was now clear in his own mind as to what Hamilton's expectation was. As the captain raised the aircraft's nose slightly just above the runway surface in order to arrest the jet's rate of descent, he would pull vertically upward the ground spoiler lever into the arm position. Nothing more. Thereafter, with main wheels spin up, the ground spoilers would deploy automatically. In the distance, ahead of 621's arrival, Andras Vasarans, the controller on duty in the tower at Pearson that morning, readied 2 Boeing 727s for departure from runway 32. As the second of the pair got airborne, Vasarans turned his attention to 621, now just inside the coastline of Lake Ontario and the western suburbs of the city, a mere 1 minute and 7 seconds from touchdown. 22 seconds later, 621 received its landing clearance, and looking ahead, Hamilton and his crew saw nothing to suggest that this landing would be anything other than routine. As the DC-8 overflew the threshold of runway 32, a mere 3.5 seconds before touchdown, 60 feet above the concrete, and at a speed of 136 knots, Hamilton uttered a simple monosyllabic, "OK," indicating to Roland his intention that he was to go ahead and arm the ground spoilers as they had discussed. But what happened next, an unintentional misselection on Roland's part, was sudden, unexpected, and ultimately to doom the fate of all those on board. Rather than simply raise the ground spoiler lever the inch or so necessary in order to arm the control surfaces for automatic deployment, Roland instead pulled the lever fully aft, causing all the spoiler devices, both flight and ground, to extend instantaneously. Immediately realising what he'd done, he instinctively tried to correct his mistake, while at the same time profusely apologising to his captain.
Sorry, Pete. Sorry.
Simultaneous with Roland's effort to correct the situation, Hamilton was heard to call out,
No!
as he applied full power to all 4 engines and pulled back on his control column through 70% of its total rearward movement in a desperate, instinctive effort to arrest the aircraft's increasing rate of descent. A rate of descent which had suddenly more than doubled from a stable 600 feet per minute to an alarming 1440. But unbeknownst to both, the split-second timing involved between inadvertent deployment and subsequent efforts to restow, a mere quarter of a second, had already sealed their fate. Despite Hamilton's best efforts to save his aircraft, it nonetheless touched down hard, very hard, at a rate of approximately 1,000 feet per minute in a nose-high, slightly right-wing low attitude. The inertia of its 94,300 kilo mass causing its tail to smack into the runway surface before bouncing and subsequently climbing back into the air less than half a second later. The time was now 8:06 and 36 seconds. Undoubtedly, Roland's misselection had been unintentional, a genuine mistake on his part. But that said, why, despite all the dialogue surrounding the spoilers, had the error happened in the first instance? The investigation team believed that subconsciously the first officer may have been conditioned to behave a certain way, based on his previous experience of flying with this particular captain. On every previous outing, Hamilton had demonstrated a preference to have the ground spoilers extended rather than armed, 2 distinctively different actions. When push came to shove, it was believed that Roland's muscle memory had kicked in, and without thinking, he had simply done what he had always done beforehand: positioned the lever from its stowed to its extended detent in one continuous movement. Although the touchdown had been brutal, with the manufacturer's estimation of such a descent rate easily resulting in a vertical acceleration upwards of 5g. None of the crew were immediately aware of exactly how punishing it had been on the airframe. The right-hand main landing gear oleo leg had been damaged as the piston bottomed out at the end of its compression stroke. The loading, although eye-watering at the aircraft's centre of gravity, was estimated to have been even greater at the aircraft's extremities. McDonnell Douglas had believed that due to the right wing's bending moments, the pylons of engines 3 and 4 had more likely experienced loads of 6.5 and 7g respectively, and this was unsustainable. Normal design philosophy would see most aircraft structural components stressed for a wide range of probable loads, typical of a normal touchdown, these being in the magnitude of 200 to 300 feet per minute. A very severe load and highly improbable, close to the capacity of the landing gear, would result from a vertical descent rate at touchdown of approximately 600 to 700 feet per minute. Rates of descent above these figures are somewhat vague, where it is generally impractical to design an airframe which will sustain such loads without some damage, but where incidents occur often enough to justify that the modes of failure should be predictable and afford the aircraft occupants the maximum degree of protection possible. In this regard, McDonnell Douglas had designed the structure of the engine and pylon assembly to fail and cleanly separate from the wing in circumstances where the vertical acceleration at touchdown exceeded these upper limitations, and at 1,000 feet per minute and 7g, this is exactly what had happened to Air Canada 621, although in truth not in the exact manner and sequence which had been envisaged. The structure had been designed such that under extreme vertical loading, the 3 mounts securing the engine to the pylon would fail in a sequential order. The 2 forward engine mounts first, followed thereafter in quick succession by the rear single engine mount. However, in the case of Air Canada 621, under such excessive loads, although the forward mounts of engine number 4 had indeed cleanly failed per design, the rear mount had not, most probably because of twisting forces being applied to the pylon at the moment of touchdown, and this was to prove extremely significant. In not cleanly breaking from the wing, the rear mount as it fractured had rather ripped from the underside of the wing a large piece of the wing plating, equivalent to approximately 12 square feet, which unfortunately had also served as the structural floor for the number 4 alternate fuel tank, located directly above the number 4 engine. Now with the gaping hole in the underside of the wing, not only had the crew physically lost the number 4 engine completely, but they had done so while compromising the adjacent fuel tank's integrity, resulting in the onset of a considerable fuel leak from the right-hand side of the aircraft. With the number 4 engine separation from the wing, all associated pneumatic, hydraulic and electrical lines had been severed, and it was this which would prove to be the catalyst for all that was about to follow. Damaged electrical cabling, which had been routed to the number 4 generator, began to flail and arc in the presence of the jet slipstream. Now being in close proximity to the deluge of leaking fuel from the tank immediately overhead, this electrical arcing was more than sufficient to ignite the turbulent fuel-air mixture, and so, almost coincident with the engine being lost, a large fireball was seen to emanate from the location of where the number 4 engine used to be. With neither Hamilton nor his colleagues immediately aware of the transpiring events outside, none could have known that the fate of their aircraft had now suddenly become precarious, to say the very least. 621 and all those on board was now in serious trouble. 8 seconds after touchdown, Hamilton exclaimed,
"We've lost our power!"
This being coincident with the recorded voltage drop in the aircraft's AC electrical system as the number 4 generator left the aircraft, was taken to mean, initially at least, that the captain had most probably noticed various warning flags appear in his cockpit instrumentation. This viewpoint was no doubt reinforced by Hill's comments 47 seconds later.
Number 4 generator's gone.
That being the initial interpretation, therefore, there was a suspicion amongst some members of the investigation team that almost 1 minute and 47 seconds had actually passed, an eternity given the circumstances, before the crew had actually registered the fact that they had completely lost the number 4 engine, with Hamilton's further exclamation,
"We've lost the number 4!
At 0808 and 24 seconds. Publication of the final report, however, would bring a fresh perspective to the events as they transpired in the seconds immediately following 621's touchdown. Further examination noted that the asymmetric condition which manifested itself with loss of the right outboard engine was immediately corrected for with Hamilton's application of left rudder. Thus, in retrospect, it was deemed more probable that his initial exclamation had indeed been a reference to the engine rather than the electrical situation, and that too much emphasis had been placed on the transcript of the cockpit voice recorder alone to explain what was going on 621's flight deck. In fact, given that Hamilton's initial exclamation was made as his aircraft transitioned into the go-round phase, it was envisaged to be highly unlikely that he was, at that moment in time, flying the DC-8 with reference to anything other than outside visual reference. That being the case, had failure flags been presented on his instrumentation during this period, in all likelihood, he most probably would never have noticed. After scanning the jet's primary engine parameters and noting a loss of fuel flow to the number 4 engine, Hill, without actually realising the engine had separated from the aircraft, called out,
Fuel!
Perhaps a premature diagnosis of what he believed the root cause of the problem to be. In acknowledgement, Hamilton ordered the engine to be shut down. Indicative of the fact that Vasarans in the tower had most probably recognised early that 621 was in trouble, was his acknowledgement of the jet's transition to the go-round, his direction to the crew to contact again the approach controller, or, should they wish, the option to fly a left-hand circuit and come back in immediately for a second approach onto runway 05 right. Hamilton verbalised his intentions almost immediately to Rowland and Hill.
We'll go around.
Presumably meaning his intention to circle back to the same runway, stating,
I think we're all right.
3 seconds later, while Hamilton continued to nurse his damaged aircraft back into the air, Rowland communicated his captain's intentions back to Vasaran. It was then, for the first time, that the controller made reference to the fact that debris from the stricken jet had been strewn across the airfield, and that as a result runway 32 was no longer available, and that the crew should thus anticipate a right-hand circuit back onto runway 23 left. On the flight deck of 621, despite the ferocious fire trailing from the aircraft's right wing, with indications that they were dealing with nothing more than a simple engine flameout, whether or not the gravity of Vasaran's comments truly resonated with Hamilton and his crew is uncertain. As the crippled jet continued to climb away from the airport, ATC issued a clearance for 621 to turn onto a heading of 070 degrees and to maintain 3,000 feet on reaching. As Hill and Rowland together attempted to shut down the number 4 engine, they experienced difficulties in manipulating the engine's thrust and fuel shut-off levers. At the same time, on reaching 3,000 feet, Hamilton's attempts to reduce power on the remaining engines, particularly number 3, which although similarly damaged from the heavy touchdown had nonetheless continued to deliver power, was also proving problematic. Then suddenly...
What was that? What happened there, Pete?
2 minutes and 31 seconds after touchdown, the cockpit voice recorder picked up an obvious crackling noise in the background, as the first of a series of explosions ripped through the burning and severely damaged right wing.
That number 4.
Large sections of the wing plating
happened.
above and below the number
look,
4
we've
alternate
got,
fuel tank and adjacent to the original damage were blown out by the force of the explosion. In addition, the fuel flow and RPM indications for engine number 3 registered sudden momentary increases before all engine parameters flatlined as 0, as it too was now blown off the wing by the strength of the explosion. Trailing flames and smoke, the detached engine plummeted downward into the Toronto suburbs below. Hydraulic pressure in the aileron and rudder systems fell to 0, forcing both into the manual degraded mode of operation, with the force of the blast also resulting in the left trailing edge wing flaps retracting by 1.5 degrees, while the corresponding flaps on the right wing extended by a further 3 degrees. There was a recorded extension of the flight spoilers on the right wing for a period of 2 seconds, and a separate indication of the main landing gear being unsafe, although in all likelihood these indications were most probably erroneously generated due to the blast itself. 2 minutes and 38 seconds after the touchdown, the aircraft started to nose over and began a gentle descent, with Rowland again offering his apologies. 5 seconds later, the DC-8's airframe was rocked by a second, equally powerful blast, which blew off a significant part of the jet's already damaged right wingtip. A third explosion, seconds later, blew off even more of the right wing's upper surface, again in the vicinity of the
We've
number
lost a
4
wing.
alternate fuel tank. With the structure of the right wing now compromised and producing significantly less lift, the aircraft rolled rapidly to the right and descended in an uncontrolled manner, impacting the ground at 0809 and 34 seconds, 2 minutes and 58 seconds after its touchdown on runway 32, at a speed of approximately 220 knots, 254 miles per hour, or the equivalent of 408 kilometers per hour. Disintegrating into millions of tiny pieces, the DC-8 had dug a furrow 8 to 10 feet deep, less than 200 feet from the home of the Bergsma family, in which 10 people lived, with the force of the impact blowing in the windows of their property. At a mere 8.5 miles or 13.5 kilometres from the threshold of the landing runway, and approximately 2.5 miles or 4 kilometres to the north of its centreline, the aircraft had come down in what is now Brampton, on the outskirts of Toronto. With the aircraft's total destruction, none of those on board would survive. The investigation team quickly established that Roland had inadvertently pulled the ground spoiler lever into the extended position, with the aircraft at 60 feet above the runway. The consequences had been devastating. But why, if utilisation of the lever was seen as an unconventional means of extending the flight spoilers in order to dump lift on the wing, had it been the case that the ground spoilers had apparently deployed as well? The Canadian investigation team quickly found that the explanations surrounding system operation and usage were, to put it mildly, ambiguous and contradictory, depending on which source material was being referenced. For example, McDonnell Douglas, the people who had designed and built the aircraft, and thus presumably the ones who would have been best placed to understand its workings, made the following statement in the aircraft's operations manual, dated August 1st, 1969, almost a year prior to the accident.
Normally, the lever is prevented from going to the extend position while in flight by a mechanical system operated by extension of the nose landing gear oleo strut.
What normally meant in the context of this statement wasn't clearly explained. However, a cautionary note from the manufacturer was contained in their manual, which stated that
If, after takeoff, should the nose gear remain compressed or the ground shift mechanism malfunction, all spoilers could inadvertently be extended manually during flight. Therefore, movement of the spoiler lever towards the extend position should never be attempted during flight. Also, during these conditions, the spoilers cannot be armed, and the spoilers will not extend automatically on touchdown. They must be extended manually by moving the spoiler lever to the extend position and pulling it up to lock it.
So the manufacturer's take was that the lever should never be used in flight to operate the spoilers. However, for Hamilton and his crew, the difficulty was that this reference, although incorporated into the DC-840 series manual, wasn't reproduced in the 63 series manual, the derivative of the type which they were flying that fateful morning. Taking the manufacturer's statements in isolation, one could draw a line under the matter here and now. However, the real-world experiences of DC-8 pilots, not just those of Air Canada, told a completely different story. The final accident report made direct reference to a submission from one Captain L.B. Wynham of Air Canada, whose testimony was deemed relevant in highlighting the operational culture in Air Canada at the time. To paraphrase, Wyman had brought to the fore two important issues. Firstly, the fact that, in light of the line pilot's continued scepticism with regard to arming the spoilers in flight, deviation from the company's standard operating procedure was now commonplace, so much so that he admitted having approached his superiors with a proposal for a compromise solution, whereby the spoilers would be armed in flight, but much later in the approach sequence, namely on the flare, the exact technique which had been favoured by Roland himself. Secondly, he was at pains to point out that having moved the spoiler lever rearward on one particular flight himself, admittedly against the manufacturer's recommendation, two things had happened. One, contrary to what the manufacturer's manual had said, the lever's mechanical rearward travel was most definitely not restricted. And two, given the aircraft's subsequent performance and the illumination of the blue ground spoiler light on the instrument panel in front of him, This movement of the lever had actually resulted in both the flight and the ground spoilers being deployed simultaneously. Again, something which McDonnell Douglas had said was simply impossible. The sad, prophetic response to Wyman's call for procedural change came from one Captain W.H. Benson, Director of Flight Standards at Air Canada. In his letter of reply, dated February 23, 1970, just over 4 months before the accident, he stated,
"This is in reference to our recent conversation and your letter of January 9, 1970, in regard to the procedure over arming the spoilers on DC-8 aircraft. I have given further consideration to this matter, and I do not feel that we could accept the change in procedure that you suggest, that being the arming of the spoilers when the aircraft is over the runway, or just prior to the flare. As discussed, inadvertent operation of the spoilers, at a period as late in the approach as you suggest, could cause even more disastrous results, and this would be possible on all approaches."
As such, Benson, from a risk management perspective, had recognised the potential adverse effect such a procedural change might bring. However, in doing so, perhaps unwittingly, he had nevertheless acknowledged the fact that spoiler deployment in flight was indeed a real possibility, and this was at odds with everything Air Canada was currently preaching on the subject. Indeed, within Air Canada at the time, the widely held belief that in-flight deployment of the ground spoilers was simply impossible was likewise shared and actively promoted by the company's DC-8 training section. Why this discrepancy was never resolved within Air Canada prior to the events of July 5, 1970, was never satisfactorily explained. In fact, many other DC-8 operators of the time were far more cautious with the published content of their operating manuals. The caution issued by the manufacturer in relation to the possibility of inadvertent spoiler deployment following nose gear oleo extension difficulties, although not incorporated into the Air Canada manuals, had nonetheless been incorporated into Braniff's. Eastern, for its part, had also incorporated the manufacturer's prohibition into their documentation. They were quite clear that movement of the spoiler lever to the extend position should never be attempted in flight. The Dutch operator, KLM, likewise had issued a very clear prohibition in its manuals, stating that, with the landing gear down and the spoiler lever in the arm position, it is possible to extend the spoilers in flight. For this reason, movement of the spoiler lever to the extend position should never be attempted with the aircraft airborne. And Air Canada's neighbour, the fellow Canadian operator of the DC-8 CP Air, had also warned its crews that the spoilers could be extended in flight by a manual selection of the lever to the extend position, and warned that pilots as a result should not apply any rearward pressure on the spoiler lever when arming the spoilers. All of which presented a markedly different perspective from that promoted by Air Canada at the time, which had simply stated, in a revision to its operations manual dated January 1st, 1968, and relating to all derivatives of the type, that the DC-8's ground spoilers could not be extended during flight under any circumstances. Both Captain Wyman and regrettably First Officer Rowland had both proven this statement to be inaccurate and fundamentally flawed. One can only surmise that had the Canadian Department of Transport, in its position as overseer, compared all three manuals against each other, namely those of McDonnell Douglas, Air Canada and Canadian Pacific, or CPR, the inconsistencies across the board may well have prompted a thorough, in-depth review of the relevant subject matter. Had that been the case, the documented ambiguities which abound amongst operating crews may well have been eliminated, and collectively, the overall safety of the DC-8 operation would have been enhanced. The issue of the spoiler extension aside, McDonnell Douglas was also in the spotlight over perceived deficiencies in the DC-8's engine mount design. Even with the hard touchdown and its subsequent damage to the aircraft, the incomplete failure sequence of the engine mounts had resulted in the adjacent fuel tank being compromised, resultant fire and eventual explosion of the right wing, the final act which had ultimately doomed the jet. Although there was some suspicion that twisting of the pylon and engine assembly at the moment of touchdown had in some way undermined this design philosophy. That said, the truth of the matter was that had the fuel tank above the No. 4 engine not been compromised, there would have been no fuel leak. Without the fuel leak, there would have been no fire. And without the fire, there would have been no catastrophic explosions. Having assessed all the available evidence, the investigation team would draw the following conclusions and ultimately issue a number of recommendations. They were of the opinion that from a design perspective, it was a mistake that the spoiler lever could ever have been manipulated by the pilot during flight into the extended position, thus deploying all spoiler devices simultaneously while airborne. In this regard, they recommended that a mechanical gate or equivalent be retrofitted to all DC-8 aircraft, specifically to mitigate against the possibility of any future inadvertent or inappropriate deployment. There was equivocation, inaccuracies and misinformation found within the content of the manufacturer's aircraft flight manual, which in itself had been approved for publication by the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States, and in Air Canada's own aircraft operating manual, as to when and how it was possible to cause the ground spoilers to be deployed. Specifically, amongst other things, in none of these manuals was there any warning that the ground spoilers of the DC-8 could be deployed with the aircraft in flight and its main landing gear extended. On the contrary, both documentation sources erroneously stated that mechanically the pilot would be prevented from physically moving the relevant operating lever into the extended position under such circumstances. Nowhere had there been written a warning to crew that rearward movement of the spoiler lever during flight would simultaneously extend both flight and ground spoilers, and that the consequences of such action within close proximity of the ground could prove catastrophic. As such, both manufacturer and airline were instructed to make the necessary amendments to their manuals, thereby addressing once and for all the ambiguity surrounding spoiler operation on the DC-8 type. The airline was criticised further for allowing the debate surrounding when and how the spoilers should be armed and utilised to continue unabated and without definitive resolution for such a considerable period of time. Sufficient evidence existed to suggest that Air Canada should have been more aware of what was routinely happening on the flight decks of its DC-8 fleet and should have taken swift, timely and proactive action to address and correct same. In this regard, the investigation team recommended that Air Canada ensure that amongst its training and checking departments, those individuals with specific responsibility for the maintenance of flight standards should ensure consistently and without fail that the correct standard operating procedure be implemented. The No. 4 engine and pylon following touchdown had not separated in the design sequential manner. The adjacent fuel tank was thus compromised, and live electrical wiring was exposed to the substantial leak which had subsequently developed, resulting in fire and multiple explosions, ultimately destroying the structure of the right wing and precipitating the loss of the aircraft itself. In this context, the report recommended that the manufacturer should review the design of the attachments of the engine pylon to wing structure, so as to ensure that a safe sequential separation under such overload conditions will take place according to the initial design philosophy. Specifically, they stated that consideration should be given to strengthening the lower wing plating attachment, which constitutes the floor of the No. 4 alternate wing fuel tank, along with the development and incorporation of devices designed to enable the electrical connections to separate in a manner which will not allow live cables to trail in the path of escaping fuel, should an engine or pylon subsequently separate or partially separate from the wing. However, all this said, the overriding, inescapable fact was that the crew of Air Canada 621 under Hamilton's charge had, for what was in their own consciousness a legitimate reason, deliberately deviated from the manufacturer's recommendation and company standard operating procedures. In so doing, they had unwittingly introduced an element of risk into the operation, which, through an unlikely and genuine misselection error, had triggered a rapid series of events which would ultimately doom their aircraft. Had they not, undoubtedly, the accident would never have happened in the first instance. From a technical perspective, this is where the story of Air Canada 621 ends. But for the families and friends of those on board, the pain and suffering of their loss was to be perpetuated time and again by the events which were to follow in the years after the accident. Even after the investigation had been closed and the wreckage of 621 long removed, for many years scattered human remains continued to surface in the farmer's field where the DC-8 had impacted the ground. Remarkably, no institution or system seemed to be in place to answer questions or take significant action to gather these remains and provide a place of final rest. On the 30th of July, some 3 weeks after the tragedy, Air Canada made arrangements for 5 caskets with 49 identified and 3 unidentified victims to be interred at the city's Mount Pleasant Cemetery. In the May of the following year, 1971, the airline erected a monument inscribed with the names of all 109 souls who were lost, adding a further memorial to the victims some 8 years later in 1979. Sadly, however, many more victims' partial remains were not recovered and remained on site at the crash scene. For the most part, families of those lost on Flight 621 lacked a relevant place of remembrance or a place to pray for their loved ones. Instead, they were left alone with their grief in the belief that their deceased loved ones had been all but forgotten. Finally, in 2010, a memorial garden and cemetery was conceptualized and made possible when 7 developers constructing new residential neighborhoods around the original crash site sought input from the victims' relatives. Soil containing remains had been excavated, gathered and preserved. A black granite plaque with the names of the 109 victims was mounted on a large granite boulder. 109 light pink granite stones representing each life lost were randomly placed within black stones laid on the garden grounds. Purple lilacs, a common planting in many farmers' fields at the time of the crash, and a favourite of many families involved, delineated the garden area. And so, on July 7, 2013, an incredible 43 years after the tragedy, more than 100 relatives and friends of the 109 souls on board gathered to officially open the Memorial Garden and Cemetery. Its location on 1/3 of a hectare site in the Humber River Valley bisects a growing residential community close to Castlemore Road and McVean Drive, and looks down a short, green, grassy corridor flanked by trees, a corridor which now marks the DC-8's exact point of impact. Before the unveiling of the site's commemorative plaque, set into a giant pink granite boulder taken from the area, relatives of the victims shared memories aloud. Some gave speeches and the names of the dead were read out. It was an emotional day with tears flowing for many as they recalled mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, sons, daughters, cousins, aunts and uncles. Many spoke of the gratitude they felt towards the developers and the city of Brampton, who had helped greatly in bringing the idea of a memorial park to fruition. But there were also bitter words for Air Canada, which some victims' relatives believed had not been compassionate or responsive enough to requests over the years to set up a similar on-site memorial like this one. Family members recounted their experiences of attempted interaction with Air Canada as cold and heartless, suggesting that the airline had done only what legally it was required to do. Many felt that Air Canada should have created a memorial garden on the site long beforehand, believing that it was shameful that the airline had abdicated responsibility to an independent third party, namely the developers of the adjacent housing development. Air Canada, for its part, which was owned by the federal government at the time of the crash, had said that it believed that the Mount Pleasant Cemetery memorial to the victims erected in 1979 was sufficient. Although the majority of relatives would not agree, with the commissioning of the on-site memorial and cemetery, they had finally found peace and recognition for those lives lost. The lives of 100 passengers and 9 crew who had perished on Air Canada's Flight 621, lost on the summer morning of July 5th, 1970.